I'm joined here today with Tish Hedger, who's joining us from our Kansas City office. Tish is a sex therapist in that Kansas City office. I'm a certified sex therapist, and today on My Counselor Live, we're answering sex therapy specific questions. We've got a number of questions that have come in. We're probably not going to get to them all today, so we're going to have to schedule another time to get back together and pick up and continue the dialogue around this. But yeah, thanks for joining, Tish. And this is a subject that you have quite a bit of interest in.
Yeah, it really is. I think I've seen God do a lot of work in couples and in individuals' lives through being able to address some of the sensitive topics in life where individuals or couples have felt a little isolated, like they haven't been sure of where to go or what would be trusted resources to confide in. And so I've found it to be very rewarding to get to be in that space with people kind of around these more sensitive subjects.
Yeah, I kind of want to set up a soapbox for you a little bit and give you an opportunity to speak to the subject of just sexuality, God's design for sex, and the church's kind of handling of the topic. That you have a unique perspective, not only as a professional counselor and as a sex therapist, but also as someone in pastoral ministry. You know, you and Josh planning a church and have been in pastoral ministry for a number of years, you know, have seen just the way the church in general has struggled to know how to navigate topics of sexuality, and both the impact that that has had on individuals, the impact that that has had on the church at large, and just want to maybe give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your perspective on kind of the role that the church maybe could play in helping the body navigate questions of sexuality, where you feel like the church seems to get it right, in maybe some of the areas that are common areas where maybe we don't get it right and create difficulties for folks. So I just want to set that up for you and give you a chance from the perspective of someone in pastoral ministry and church planning, and what it is that you see and maybe even would like to see for the pastors and those in ministry that are viewing this.
I think the first thing that comes to mind on what is a healthy role for the church to play is to make it a safe place for the subject to be mentionable. That it would be a safe place for there to be questions, for there to be struggles, that oftentimes there is like a healthy kind of theology of God's design for sexuality and the parameters around what healthy sexuality is in singlehood and in marriage. But I think of being able to make space for, well, what if we're pursuing God's design and there's struggles and kind of everything that we knew sex was supposed to be like in marriage, we can't, there's emotional struggles, there's anxieties, there's difficulties. And so I think the church making it a safe place to struggle with sexuality in marriage, to struggle with it in singlehood. I think our culture there's so many toxic messages. Our culture is so damaging as far as how it portrays and conveys sexuality. And so I think my heart would be for the church and for believers to be very bold in speaking up for what does healthy sexuality look like. And it's okay to be in a process of sexual sanctification. That just like our whole selves, sexuality needs sanctification. It needs truth. It needs healing. It's been through stuff, right? It's been through trauma. It's been through internalizing wrong messages. It's been through confusing experiences, maybe that we don't quite understand. It's experienced shame. It has been wronged or harmed by others. And so, if we aren't able to go into that space and be able to be comfortable with discussing the subject, then then a lot of needs are not being met. A lot of wounds are not, the remedy isn't available for a lot of wounds. And so I think that's the first thing that comes to my mind as far as the role of the church in this subject.
Can we maybe get real practical for a minute? So if I'm a pastor, I'm in pastoral ministry, and watching this video and thinking about, what does that look like? What does that mean practically? How can I try to cultivate within our congregation, within our church, a dialogue around these things? How can I kind of help us as a body, as a local body, to do that very thing? Like, what does that look like in the local church context?
I think making space for the conversation to be had. Because I think when you hold space for that, then people are going to flock to that space and say, help, we have questions, we're struggling. What do we do? Where do we go? Are there trusted resources? We've read these books and we've tried everything in the books, but it's not working. And we don't know why. And we're confused and we're scared and we're struggling with shame. And so I think being able to hold space for that, that will naturally cultivate a culture where people are coming with their sexual struggles or fears or difficulties. And then it gives the pastoral leadership or the leaders in the church the opportunity to be in that space with their people. And
yeah, I was just going to say, I'm thinking about one forum and one venue in which I know that you and Josh have done that, has been like with as a segment or part of a marriage type retreat, right? A marriage and sexuality type forum. A lot of churches, especially around February, will do or plan a sort of marriage enrichment type retreat or getaway or conference or seminar, something to just enrich the couples of their church. And when you guys have done that, on some occasions, you've been intentional about creating space within that to get real practical when it comes around marriage sexuality. Is that right?
Yeah, it is right. I think there's two kind of places in church that I think that we've done this. One is a part of a sermon series where they kind of go over subjects and culture. And one of them, there's just a sermon on sexuality. And I think opening up that space of like, oh, the pastors are talking about this from the pulpit. It must be okay to talk about this. It must be okay to have questions about this. And then as far as the...
Can we pause there for a moment? I want to maybe construct some bullet points here. That if I'm a pastor kind of thinking, okay, a message, I get doing a message, preaching, that makes sense. Topical kind of sermon series. Okay, so if we were going to help kind of craft a message, right? What would be like some of the bullet points that would want covered? Maybe now I can tag team that a little bit. So then just getting real practical. What is that voice and making that space? What are some of the important things to cover? And I'll go first. Then I think one of the bullet points that I think are really important for us to hear from leadership is that it is common for things to not go easily. And that there's a belief kind of within the church sometimes that if we are if we love Jesus and that we're looking to honor God in our marriage, and especially if we have kind of been intentional about stewarding our sexuality before being married, that when we get married, then the sky is going to split open, the light's going to shine down, angels are going to chime, and it's just going to be easy. The sex will be easy. Everything will just know what to do. It'll flow naturally, and that will be bliss. And for a lot of couples, that's not their experience. Like, it's really common for sex to be difficult at first, and for things to not necessarily work right, and to need some direction on how to navigate some of the challenges that come with that. And yet, if we don't talk about that reality, then it sends the implied message that there's this is a rare thing, and that there's just something especially wrong with me, or I'm inept or inadequate in some way. And for everybody else, this is easy. For everybody else, this just flows naturally. They don't even feel awkward, and that is just easy.
We're the
And
only.
so you're the only ones. That's kind of the message. You're the only ones. No one else struggles with these things. And so I think one important piece that I would just love to have be heard is to have difficulties is really normal. That more people than not have difficulties of one sort or another. That's common. And you're not supposed to know how to have great, amazing sex as you come into marriage. That it ought to be the worst sex of your whole life. Because the great sex takes time and development and learning yourself and learning your spouse. And so it's supposed to be messy and difficult and have struggle at the beginning of it. So that would be my first bullet point that I would, maybe not the first one, but it'd be one of the bullet points that I would want in that sermon.
Yeah, I think another part of the message is like correct theology about sex. And so I think for me, really wanting to convey why God created sex, what's the
Mm-hmm.
purpose of sex, that for sex is for the purpose of bringing greater unity in the marriage. It's to also be about being fruitful and multiplying, but it's also about receiving pleasure and
Mm-hmm.
sharing pleasure. And that sex is and so I think of being able to talk about things that sex is not. Sex is not just a duty, that if it's reduced to only obligation or duty, as far as like, this is my like duty to comply with, that isn't really the heart that God created sexuality in. That he created sexuality for women's pleasure and for men's pleasure. And often I think I've talked to women or been at women's conferences where there has been kind of a misconception of the purpose of sexuality, that that there isn't the permission or maybe even the understanding that what makes a fulfilling sex life and what makes feeling connected possible is by being very present in receiving pleasure and experiencing pleasure and sharing that with your spouse. And so I think, so that's like the design piece. And I think the theological piece of that sex is good, that sex is meant to convey just the special, unique, one-of-a-kind unity between a man and a wife, that exemplifies Christ's oneness with the church, and that it's this like physical manifestation of that oneness that brings even deeper connectedness, that it conveys God's heart of his pursuit for his people and people's response to his pursuit, and all of these really beautiful characteristics of God that he saw fit to display through our own sexuality and how he's wired sexuality in human beings.
Yes, yes, yes. And there's such I think an intentional and strategic attack of the enemy on this part of our life and relationship and experience that it is in the secular culture distorted in this way that says sex is whatever you want it to be, that there's no parameters on it, there's no structure, there's no limits, that's whatever you feel like pursuing or engaging in doing. It can be exploitive in nature, and it's about what I want and I enjoy, sometimes at the cost or expense of others. There's power and control dynamics, all sorts of the distortion of God's design outside of the church, the secular realm. Then the enemy has taken a really strong attack on sexuality within the church as well. It's just a different strategy and approach, but it still distorts sexuality. It just distorts it in this other direction that says that sex is dangerous and it's bad, and that you need to be afraid of your own sexuality because it's such a destructive force. It's that sexual desire and pleasure is bad and lustful and evil, and so the experience of arousal or being horny or having sexual desire is your sinful flesh kind of on display there, and that sex is shameful, so we can't talk about it. And so there's this silence around it that gives the enemy opportunity to influence young folks and influence within the church in a way that's destructive, because he's able to fill that void, that silence, with messages from the culture. That there's this sense of using sex to create tension and disconnect between couples when God designed it to bring them closer together and bring connection. And there's just this real strategic, I think, attack on sexuality that's been really effective. Like the enemy has been really effective in creating all sorts of pain within couples, within the church and the body, by way of our silence and by way of our distorting of what sexuality is in God's design in terms of something good for us to enjoy and embrace and pursue, and to celebrate, and making it something different. And we've really seen that generation after generation. Like there's a long history of this. And you go back into biblical times and you see the attack on sexuality within the New Testament culture and the Roman culture of the time that the New Testament is set in, and just the perverseness of that culture around sexuality and the distortion of it outside the church. But then you see this reactionary move from inside the church, of the church being afraid of sexuality as a result of the perverseness, the brokenness in the culture. And you see folks like Augustine, who's probably struggled with a sexual addiction of sorts, and having this kind of fear about his own sexuality because of the destructiveness that it caused in his life and the direction of his life. You see in the Protestant Reformation, you see folks like Martin Luther saying that, that sex was the original sin, that's what happened, that that Adam and Eve had sex and that was the fall of man, and that sex is necessary for procreation, but you need to repent afterwards
And not
because it's right. And then you have John Calvin, who was kind of the liberal of the time, right, and was like, Martin, you're crazy. Of course you can have sex without it being a sin. That's nuts. What are you thinking? So long as you don't enjoy it, because if you enjoy it, that's lust, and then you need to repent. So you have these kind of messages that are reactionary from the culture, that aren't founded in the Bible, aren't a part of the good design of sex that God wired into our body and said this is good in the garden, and that celebrates it in the scriptures. That has been, I think, a part of the attack of the enemy within the church to distort our messaging around sexuality. And so by breaking the silence and communicating good theology around sexuality, we go a long way in combating, the uh, attacks of the enemy around this subject.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah. I think that the silence is creates a vacuum, a lot of wrong messages, a lot of misconceptions, and that that I've seen in my own life and in my own clients, that whenever we're kind of alone inside, this is becomes like a motivator, and it begins to structure how we react in our relation in our sexuality, in our relationships, or in our life. And so I think of the church creating conversation and speaking into that space, that it also invites believers into sanctification, into awareness of what's happening inside of them, and how do they think about their sexuality. And might know that God created it and it's good, but what does that mean as far as like their felt sense of sexuality? And being able to have those conversations is so important for the health of marriages and for individuals in singlehood and across the board.
Totally, totally, totally. I'd want to throw in the bullet point of uh, there's this experience that we call sexual aversions that happen, which means when we have negative experiences sexually, that involves some element of sexuality, that negative emotional experience can get paired with our sense of sexuality. And so that pairing can carry forward into marriage and into our marriage relationship. And so if you experience molestation or abuse of some sort of a sexual nature, that icky feeling of being exploited sexually, and that can get associated with your sexuality and can come out when you experience sexual stimuli in the present. And so even though that may have been a long time ago and involved somebody not your spouse, and you're like, well, that was a long time ago and I'm married and I love this person, that there can be this sense of that that shouldn't follow me into this relationship, but very often it does. And a lot of times we don't realize that. As counselors, we take that for granted because we kind of recognize that that's a thing that commonly happens. But so many clients that I've worked with come in and go, they come in because they're having difficulties, low sexual desire or arousal disorders, or some sort of sexual difficulty in their marriage. And as I'm taking their history and kind of gathering the information, as we do as part of the sex therapy process, they're like, oh yeah, and I had this thing happen to me. I was raped in high school, or had this experience with a cousin that fondled me, or some sort of experience that they've had that was this negative, emotional, sexual related experience. They're like, it probably doesn't have anything to do with this, but since you're asking, I thought I would throw that out there, that this is a thing that happened in my story. Like, yes, that's very relevant. That very much could be part of the negative feelings that you have around sex now, and the lack of interest that you have in sex now. That there's a unprocessed trauma that has created an aversion that's followed you into the present. And so it may have very little to do with you and your spouse, and more about some of these experiences that have come into the relationship that need to find some healing. So I would want to have that as a bullet point in the service, in the sermon.
Yeah, that's such an important one. And I think it speaks to like what you're saying is so important. But as far as sexual aversion in general, that is one very common experience that people have. Um, and I would want people to know that our sexuality is very complex and impacted by a lot of variables. And so one variable can be past abuse and trauma that involved sexuality. It can also be, I've seen this often, Josh, and maybe you can speak to this too, aversion or kind of negative, like gross feelings towards sex, because that is what they heard about sex their whole entire life. That there's this connection with sex being dirty, sex being gross, sex being bad, and the message wasn't received that actually your sexuality is wonderful, your body's sexual responses are beautiful. But this is God's design, this is how you steward your sexuality. That what is, kind of the message internalized is sexuality is gross and bad, and even a lot of times that connected with a person's own body. Then they go into marriage and feel like, I don't know, like we're going to walk down the aisle and the switch is going to be flipped, and a message that's been reinforced for decades is all of a sudden it's like, oh, now sex is wonderful. And that a lot of women are like, I was so pure, you know, we worked so hard. I worked so hard to do what, I believed God wanted from me. And now I find myself in marriage and I don't like sex. It disgusts me or it's gross to me. And so I think that that's another thing that I see common that can create arousal disorders and, very strong physiologically based aversion to sex.
Definitely, totally. And it's not equally distributed either. That is that phenomena is even more slanted in a negative way towards women and female sexuality, right? That both kind of inside the church, outside the church, a young woman, rather a teenager, young adult, a young woman who is horny, who's interested in sex, and is curious about sexuality, maybe feels the desire and want for sex. What's the kind of the label that we societally kind of places on a young girl like that?
Yeah, she's easy, she's slutty, these
Yeah,
derogatory names
yeah,
about her identity.
right. Very pejorative, negative, shaming kinds of messages that as a man I didn't experience. As a young man, and then it was just assumed that I would be interested in sex. It was just assumed that that was kind of a normal and natural and healthy thing for a young man to be curious about or be interested in or to experience arousal and sexual attraction. That was just what it was supposed to be. In fact, the opposite may have been true, that if a boy, young man didn't have kind of a high interest in sex or high arousal, that there's something wrong with him, that and that it was a pejorative or negative thing. And so even guys that I knew that didn't necessarily have a high sex interest at that early in high school or in high school, would fake it, and kind of talk locker room talk or kind of engage in order to not be identified as something weird or wrong, with him. And so it's very much an unfair dynamic. And I think we see that as sex therapists a lot, just a lot of women coming in all of that negative messaging that they have experienced and that they learn to associate with their sense of interest in sex, their sense of arousal or desire or curiosity, that was, oh, this is bad and this makes me bad and I shouldn't want this or shouldn't feel this or shouldn't think this or shouldn't, shouldn't, right? All those shaming kinds of messages that really get tied up with their sense of sexual self and identity in a way that, yeah, just doesn't go away when you get married. It just doesn't reverse like that, believe it or not.
Yeah. And then I think I'm just, as we talk about this, I'm so struck with the suffering it causes in relationships.
Oh,
Because it feels in marriage, it feels like I love this person and I'm attracted to them, or they say they love me, they say they're attracted to me. Why don't they want to have sex with me? Or what's wrong with me? Why don't I desire sex with my spouse? There's something horribly defective about me. Or the spouse who is on the receiving end of the spouse who has the aversion. Oftentimes it's the husband who's on the
what's wrong with me?
I am
You
just,
know, am
yes,
I not attractive? Am I not desirable? Why
right.
doesn't my spouse want me? Do they wish they had married somebody else? Do they feel like they made a mistake? Am I inadequate in some way? Are they disappointed with me as a sexual partner?
Yes, there's so much rejection, anxiety, and which causes even conversation about it to be very charged, very difficult to have open conversations about it. And so I think as far as our conversation as what bullet points we'd want to share, I think I'd want to share that sex is a very complicated relationship activity. And
Mm-hmm.
there are so many variables that impact the development of our sexuality, our first encounter with sexuality, what we were taught about the body and how to understand, and the spiritual and cultural messages that informed our development. And, there's all of these pieces. And then there's a physiological aspect as well, that is a big part of it as also. And so I think of being able to zoom out and not have it oversimplified, that if we love each other and if we find each other attractive, then sex should work. And if sex doesn't work, then it's because we don't love each other well, or there's something wrong with me, or I'm not attractive to my spouse or desirable. And so I think I would want couples to hear that and to know that.
Totally. I would want to have in there, I hope there's pastors kind of taking notes, because this one message, these bullet points that we're talking through here would speak to so many different things that a sex therapist we see come into our offices. Just this next bullet point and put in there, that sex is not supposed to be painful and hurt.
Mm.
Like that, it's supposed to be experienced physically positively.
Mhm.
And if you're experiencing it as painful, something's wrong.
Mhm.
And not only is something wrong, but we can probably figure out what it is and fix it. Like,
Mhm.
like those, it's not like permanently broken kind of wrong, and that just something isn't working the way that it's supposed to. And that you shouldn't have the expectation of just playing through the pain or grinning and bear it or engage in duty sex because you owe it to your spouse. And that if it's painful, if it's unpleasant, then something's off, something's not right, and it can be figured out. We can be troubleshot. And I mean, there's just something really tragic to me when I have a couple come in. They've been married 5 years, 10 years, and the whole time they've had pain, and it's been unpleasant, and it's been hard, and it's been so many things that have taken place. I've experiences where desire has disappeared because of pain. I've worked with cases where gals have dyspareunia or have sexual pain, and because of the care and empathy that a husband has for for his wife, that he's become impotent and isn't able to achieve or maintain an erection, and that because it's associated with causing his wife pain. And now we've got both of these difficulties that we're facing and experiencing. And so I would just want to put that out there, that it's not supposed to be painful. It's supposed to feel good. If it doesn't, something's wrong.
Yeah, that's such an important message. I think there's sexuality is such a, I don't even know quite the right word. It's just so tied to our personhood that it feels like if I'm having pain, then I'm doing something wrong. I'm defective somehow. Like my body's broken. It's not working. And I've seen there be so much shame around that, and it makes it very difficult to talk about or to reach out for help. And so I think of knowing that this is actually something that happens, that is common among women to experience pain with sex for various reasons. And then to go months, years of pushing through the pain, like you're saying, that it does pair pain with sexuality, kind of what you were referring to before. And so then it reinforces that negative emotional pairing with sexuality. And that's being wired into into the woman's mind and body and emotions. And I would want to say, to everyone who's listening, that can be healed, that is not like a life sentence. And so even if you're watching this and it's been 5 years and you're that couple, I think I would just want to encourage those people to reach out for help, because because there is help available. God created our bodies in an amazing way for them to heal.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you have another bullet point?
I'm thinking through our bullet points.
I was thinking about the opposite of this one, right? So if sex is not supposed to be painful,
it is supposed to be pleasurable.
which maybe seems like a given, but so often it's not, right? Yeah. Like there's this, is it normal or common that I wouldn't be orgasmic? Is that the way it's supposed to be? Is it a rare kind of thing, or is sex for my husband? Is it for the man? And is it normal and okay for it to not be an enjoyable experience for me? What would you say to that, Tish?
I would say that is not how God designed sex to be. And that anytime that we experience those types of blocks or struggles, that is a symptom of something that just needs attention, something that needs care, something that needs troubleshot, something that needs worked through. It's like telling a story of something that's going on. And whether that's mentally, sexuality, it's like our bodies and our mind and our emotions kind of all have to align for our sexuality to be healthy and to be able to be present with our spouse in pleasure. And so whenever we aren't able to experience pleasure mentally, emotionally, or physiologically, then there's just something that's not aligned.
Yeah. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be like that, to your point about, probably the most tragic thing for me as a sex therapist, as a Christian sex therapist, is meeting with folks, again, that have been 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years into their marriage and are struggling with these things that are very curable, very addressable. And they just didn't know where to turn or where to go, or didn't know if this is just the way that it is. And when I hear that, I'm like, because then we lean into and we work on these things and they find healing, and there's all this excitement about things being different, but there's also this grief. I commonly hear, man, I wish we could have connected with you 20 years ago. I wish we could have connected with someone 5 years ago. The last 5 years could have been very different if only we had known that it didn't have to be this way.
Yes. The grief, the loss. Yeah.
Totally. Well, hopefully there's someone out there taking notes for a sermon series up and coming, and that just these pieces the church needs to know, the body needs to know, this message needs to get out there. If you have a platform from which you can declare God's truth around sexuality, I would encourage you to be a sexual evangelist, in the words of my friend and mentor, Doug Rosenau, and really shed God's light and his truth around sexuality, to kind of fill the void, fill the darkness with truth in a way that helps set folks free and helps them find healing and redemption in this area of their life, and really to communicate a message about the goodness of God's design around sexuality, and rather than a negative, ugly kind of message around it, kind of cast a vision for a very fun, cool, dynamic, God-reflective sexuality that reveals some really cool things about the heart of God.
Yeah. So good.
I want to shift gears a little bit. We've got a number of questions that have come in around sexuality. And if you're just tuning in, we've been talking a little bit about theology of sexuality and common misbeliefs and things that we run into as sex therapists, working with folks, and really in the frame of thinking about, man, if there's pastors out there that are thinking about how do I encourage the dialogue or encourage the conversation around sexuality within my church. Just some bullet points of how you might go about doing that. But I want to turn now to some of the questions that we've had come in. If you've got questions as you're listening to this, you can comment them below, and Leah, who's producing for us, will add them to our list of questions. If you're concerned about other people seeing your question, there's a web form on our website at MyCounselor.Online/ask, where you can anonymously submit a question. You can also private message our Facebook page, and that will get to Leah and get added to our list. So still opportunity for you to get questions in. We've got a lot of questions that have come in, and so we may not get to all of them today, but Tish and I are going to be back doing another segment on sex therapy and sex therapy related questions here in a few weeks. So if we don't get to your question today, we will keep it and add it to the list for us to return back to here in a few weeks. The first question I want to kick to you, Tish, is from a couple that says they're a newly married couple and want to know if we have any tips for dealing with performance anxiety.
Oh, yes. I love this question. I think recognizing that we can put a lot of pressure on ourselves to show up to that space of like, okay, I need to be the right thing. Is my spouse enjoying themselves? And, kind of being up on the bed and of kind of observing and critiquing ourselves and our performance. And it just feels like so much is at stake. Like I need to perform so that we can have this amazing, magical experience. And I think really changing the mindset of the goal of that time of sexual connection, to really that it's about learning, it's about practicing, it's about exploring, it's about playfulness, that there's no, I think culture can really convey sexuality as, it's, I am, just thinking of a time when I first was married and like gave my husband a black eye because I elbowed him, right underneath the eye. It's like, it's kind of awkward and we're like, you're clumsy and it's just not anything like the movies. Like that's not real.
Totally. Yeah, it's totally not smooth and easy like the movies, and it's not always like this high intensity kind of performance driven sort of thing. That like the cultures and movies would suggest.
Yes, where it's just like intense and everyone's so sultry. Like our sexuality should be an extension of our whole personality. That there's laughing and fun and that it's really you and your spouse coming together, exploring your sexuality together. And I think when that expectation can shift, that we're not trying to create this certain type of experience, but we are exploring our sexuality together. This is a part of our life that we're like building this together. We're learning about ourselves. I want to learn about you. And that there's just so much room to not know, to be figuring it out, for it to be awkward, for sometimes it's going to feel really awkward, and that is normal. That is very, very normal. And so I think whenever in your mind you have, oh, it should be like this, and I should be able to perform this way and give my spouse like this experience where we're both climaxing at the exact same time and fireworks go off and, and that just isn't real life. And so that's the advice I would give.
I love it. And I like the shift in mindset, right? From a performance-based mindset of trying to do it for my spouse or do it to my spouse, but instead it's a matter of sharing with my spouse. Right? that it's not a taking from, it's not a doing to or a doing for, that it's a sharing with,
Mhm.
and that we're building something together, and we're learning together, and we're having fun together, and there's closeness, there's connection. That is the context for the passion and intensity that can be a part of and is part of sexual experience as well.
Yes, and I think what's on my mind about this is, and Josh, you can speak to this too, but husbands, I feel like our culture conveys, like you were sharing about the young teenager who didn't experience this super high sex drive, but in the locker room, he's feeling this pressure to convey, this kind of hyper masculine sexuality. And I think of, you know, there can be a lot of performance anxiety I've seen in husbands, that it's like I should want sex all the time and I should be able to perform like in this certain way at this certain level, and it should look like this, and if I don't, then I'm
Mhm.
not manly, or I'm not a good lover, or there's a discrepancy again, uh, kind of comparing what culture conveys as healthy masculine sexuality and then what the actual reality is.
Totally. And there's this like total mythology out there, kind of toxic masculinity mythology that's out there. Like men are supposed to intuitively know how to be amazing lovers, right?
Mm.
Like it's just like as a gene or something, and this and that. We just know exactly how to pleasure a woman in a way that will blow her mind and create amazing sexual experiences every time. And if you don't intuitively know how to engage that, there's just something wrong with you, because every other guy totally, is just like born with that gene and kind of knows. And so if feel awkward and out of your depth and like you have no idea what you're doing with this creature that's totally different than you, then then there's just something wrong with you. And
Yes.
yet,
This creature is totally different than you. And that I have heard an author describe it this way, that a woman's sexuality is like the cycle of the moon. Literally, because it's like different things are going to feel good, and her sexuality and how she experienced pleasure literally changes. So even if you were to, spend your whole life learning your wife, there's some things you're going to be able to learn, and then there's some things that are still going to be mysterious, that God created it where there has to be so much communication.
totally intentionally, it's part of the design, right? Like men and women are so different in our sexuality, right? When the perfect picture, I think, for like male sexuality is the Staples Easy button, right? You've seen those commercials. There's like the big red button, and you hit it, and it says that was easy, right? That's kind of like in a nutshell male sexuality. Like it kind of functions the same way every time. It's maybe differing degrees of intensity, but it's pretty reliable and straightforward, and it's just kind of does its thing, right? Female sexuality, on the other hand, more like the cockpit of a 747, man. Yeah, knobs and doodads and dials, and it's always changing all the time. What felt good at one time in the same experience will feel not good later, or what worked magic the last experience falls flat this time. Like it's just totally changing, evolving piece. And that really requires communication and relational connection and a learning of your own body and being able to share that and being able to learn each other. And that it's just part of the design that God built into it. And so if a man approaches a woman based on his own experience of sexuality and thinks that if I engage her like I want to be engaged in them, then it is not going to turn out so well. Like we're clueless. We have no idea what it's like to be a woman, and we have no idea what it is that a woman needs in order to have a great sexual experience. And so it really does require a learning of your specific woman, right? Because every woman is different. And while there's similarities in terms of the variety that women experience, that you learning the relational aspects of what it is to be in a relationship and share a sexual relationship with your woman, man, and learning the nuance and the changes and the ability to connect with where they're at today. I mean, yeah, there's not a gene or preset knowledge or a Karma Sutra book that you can read that somehow will reveal all of the mysteries and make you a master. That's Hollywood. That's not reality.
Right. It's just complete fantasy.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's
totally.
meant to require so much sharing and vulnerability because it's vulnerable to share. Um, I meet with a lot of couples and it's kind of like, what does conversation look like during your sexual, connection? And there's very,
And their eyes kind of go like this, right? Like,
yeah, like, oh, we don't talk to each other.
like talk to each other?
Right. And that then you're really totally flying blind that, there's no way to read each other's minds. And I think of having an expectation of this should just be an 8, that we should just know. And that just is not ever. I mean, maybe I shouldn't speak in such absolutes, but I can't say absolutely that God intentionally did not create it that way, I believe.
Yeah, totally, totally.
Mhm.
Hey, this next question I think is such a vulnerable question and such a really, really valuable one that I don't know a whole lot of resources that speak to this, and yet it is like universal in terms of the experience of it and the struggle of it, and and, and specifically for you women, right? You could apply it to men also, but as I'm working with couples, it's tends to be, and this question is from a gal, and it's really about, what can I do to grow in my sense of sexual confidence? Okay?
Mm.
Like there's this sense of insecurity and inadequacy and just not knowing how to own that part of my identity, how to engage it with confidence and boldness, and that insecurity maybe causes to avoid connecting or pursuing, or so yeah, could you maybe just take a little bit and talk about uh, what a woman can do in order to try to bolster, develop, make space for settling into her own sense of sexual identity and confidence around her sexuality?
Yeah, I think I first just want to normalize the, how universal that this is. And I think it is in varying degrees depending on how womanhood and sexuality was conceptualized throughout girlhood into development. And that if you've grown up with kind of wrong messages about the beauty of your sexuality, the beauty of your body, then that even makes it more difficult to kind of settle into healthy sexuality in adulthood. Some things that are coming to mind is one, being able to sit with what are your specific kind of insecurities. The what is kind of the root of kind of what you're afraid of or what feels uncomfortable to you, maybe. And so anything that you feel uncomfortable with kind of tells a story about opportunities for growth. So, like, for example, if you have a lot of discomfort with your body and your body does not feel, it's hard for you to kind of accept that your body is beautiful or desirable, and you find yourself criticizing your body a lot, or when your spouse compliments you, your beauty, you kind of dismiss it or it's hard to receive that. Well, that is going to be that's going to impact how you're able to kind of inhabit your own body and your sexuality. And so I think being able to embrace the beauty of your body and to be able to work through your own kind of body image wounds, possibly. Um, I think being able to give yourself permission to think about sex, because for women, our minds are complicated places with a lot going on. There's a lot of traffic control going on up here. And so I think that it's just very natural for the majority of women to experience that there, like, just days go by and like sex may not even occur to you. And so, of kind of making it intentional, that part of cultivating your own sensuality and your own sexuality is to make space in your life to think about your spouse, to think about sex, to think about the last time you connected with your spouse, to just make space mentally for that. I think another part of sexual confidence is being able to communicate what you need, what you want, what feels good. And I think that that is very vulnerable. People, we experience that as very vulnerable, individuals do, to even be able to say this feels good, or I want this, or I desire this, that can be very intimidating to communicate that to your spouse. And so I think that part of building confidence is taking risk and sharing, and kind of sharing honestly what you feel, what you want, and then as your spouse responds to that, then that's going to build more confidence, and being able to yeah, just be comfortable in your sexuality. As far as the other thing I'm thinking of is noticing your own femininity and the things that help you feel connected to your femininity and your sensuality in a beautiful way, that God created your femininity, created that to be a really a nutritious, vital part of your relationship with your spouse. And so, the more that you can connect with the beauty of your femininity and the way that God created you, and the different things that might, you know, maybe that looks like having space to relax and go on a walk and just be able to enjoy nature. Maybe that looks like, and this is very maybe practical, but I'm going to invest, in some nice pajamas that make me feel comfortable and beautiful, and make me feel good in my skin. Kind of these little things that can really make a big impact in a woman's confidence in her sensuality, femininity, and how that plays into her sexuality.
Totally, totally. I think about different, that self-awareness piece of being aware of the things that help me feel sexy. And that, again, there can be so much cultural training, church cultural training of avoiding being sexy.
Mm-hmm.
Or there's so much kind of focus on rather putting the responsibility for uh, male purity, sexual purity on women, and making it their job or responsibility to kind of keep men pure, as it were. That the sense of uh, feeling desirable, looking desirable, having a sense of attractiveness or feeling sexy is a bad thing. And so I need to counteract that in every way, shape, or form that I possibly can. And then to come into marriage, be like, okay, so now how do I embrace feeling sexy and being seductive of my husband and pursuing him, and feel okay with having those feelings and lean into and develop that. It's a there can be a lot of uh, current going one direction to try to reverse and go the other direction, and think about what does it look like for me to embrace this, and to be like, okay, how do I affirm this part of who I am, and how do I affirm the playful, flirtatious, seductive kind of pursue the attractions of my spouse kind of dynamic, and what are the things that help me feel good in that. And maybe you could speak just a little bit about ways in which gals can counteract that, um, maybe that uh, trend or that piece, or the kind of in inculcated mindset of not being sexy
Mm.
in order to be okay and embrace that, pursue that within their marriage relationship.
Ah, yeah. I mean, I think, it is very God honoring to be modest, right? And in a culture where feminine sexuality is so displayed in a provocative, degrading, kind of lustful way, I think that growing up myself in the church as a teenager, kind of the message was kind of that I internalized is basically like your body's dangerous. And so kind of, cover it up and don't draw too much attention to yourself and, kind of, um, I don't know, kind of this sense of your body's beauty. I think, unfortunately, the message that gets sent is kind of your body's beauty is bad and brings bad things versus the sense of your body is really beautiful and it deserves to be honored. What does that look like for it to be honored? And so, anyway, I think, moving into marriage where there is this space for your sexuality to be expressed, I think being able to just what you said, affirm God's design of your sexuality, that, being able to accept that He made you a sexual being and that your sexuality is not, um, it's not externalized from you and only about your spouse's desire for your sex. Not if a if kind of if you've been taught to detach from your sexuality, detach from your sexual desires, and don't be sexy, then you come into marriage and what I've seen a lot is that the tendency is to lean into, okay, I'm basically the husband's sexuality is the whole sexuality of the relationship. And that isn't how God designed it to be. And so for women to be able to um, really affirm and accept that they're sexual beings, affirm and accept that God created their body beautiful, and that to allure their husband, for it to be a gift in marriage to share with their spouse their pleasure and their presence and um, yeah, so I mean, I think the counteracting the message um, that of just not being sexy or being sexy is bad. I think it's just accepting that God created you a sexual being, um, and to be willing to step out in that, explore that, become more comfortable with that. And so,
Totally good word. The we started in kind of that piece with just the normalcy and the universality of that kind of struggle. That there are things that men struggle with kind of universally in terms of our adequacy and that are just kind of common difficulties that men experience. And in my experience, one-on-one female clients that I've worked with, one-on-one women that I know have struggled around this part of their experience and feeling confident and comfortable in their own body and extending that into confident and comfortable in their own body when it comes to sexuality and engaging sexually. So super common, and appreciate you, Tish, taking some time to speak to that a little bit, as there's just such a need for us to talk about these common things more so that we're able to kind of break out of the stigma around that and learn how to navigate that into a healthy, strong, God-honoring, and enjoyable sexual identity that we can share together in marriage. So awesome. Love that. Got this next question that we've got is a one about a tough situation, right? She says, I cringed with physical touch, hugging, kissing. How can my body participate in foreplay and get aroused if I don't like touch? Right?
Mm.
And there's a few different scenarios where I have kind of worked with folks with this experience. I think the most common one is then when there's been some sort of trauma or aversion that has gotten associated with touch. And I don't know if you can maybe speak a little bit to that one, Tish, as far as how do we navigate that? How does somebody that has that kind of triggering drawback, pull away response with their spouse? They love their spouse, want to be close, um, and isn't necessarily sure why they do this to their spouse's touch.
Yeah, this can be so confusing to experience this, that your mind and heart are feeling something so different. It's like your body is not cooperating with what your mind and heart know to be true and want. I've had um, um, women tell me, I feel violated. I know he's not trying to, like, sex feels violating to me, touch feels violating to me, even though I know that's not his heart and I love him and I feel safe with him, and they feel so confused. And so I think I would just want to first talk about the powerful physiological wiring that any traumatic experience creates in our bodies. And so in that moment, it's a little bit like our brain is coding that, the kind of metadata around us, as being like this other situation. And then our kind of thinking mind, it kind of goes offline, and our body is in this reaction mode where it's doing, you know, two things. One, it's remembering what it was like to feel that violating or that scary experience. So literally, that the flinching away, the pulling away, is the body, like a feeling memory, the body remembering what it was like before, and that being pulled into the present and literally experiencing it in the moment. So the person's body is not present and connected with, this is my spouse and I'm safe. Their body's actually connected with the past, pulling the past into the present, and the past is getting blended, and the person is experiencing that in the moment in their body. And then two, their body's having a really natural reaction to that, to pull away from that, to feel disgusted by that, or to feel afraid. And I think a lot of times when that's not understood, you have the added layer of anxiety of, why am I having this response? You know, something is horribly, horribly wrong with me, that, or they feel ashamed and they're trying to hide it. And there's all of this anxiety, there's all of this angst. And so I think of recognizing that that is a very common experience for women to have, or for men to have, that have been sexually assaulted, sexually abused, or even have any experience where sexuality or touch was associated to a very negative emotional experience. That it's very normal for an, a present experience to pull that past into the present and then to be re-experiencing it. So the first step is for the couple just to know that. And so for the husband or for the spouse on the other side to know, this isn't something that you did, this isn't you being rejected, this is not because you're not a good lover or because your spouse thinks that you're violating them. That this is literally, it's like in the moment, the trauma's in the room with you, the dragon's in the room with you. And when there's not understanding, the dragon comes between and it isolates the two. The one who's having the trauma response shuts down, the other spouse feels confused and bewildered. But whenever there's understanding, then to be able to lock arms, and for and we'll just use a husband and his wife is traumatized, just for easy speaking. So then when you know that, the wife can make that explicit, I'm having this response in my body. And then you stop, and the couple is like, okay, the dragon is in the room. They lock arms, and the husband is able to shift his his love to be focused in the direction of now battling and protecting from the dragon. And that looks like, you know, kind of pausing and saying, what do you need? Or just sitting there. um, you know there's a lot of things that we lead couples through of what that space might look like. But the important thing is that the couple has a sense of, we're doing this together. This isn't us. This is something that's happening to us. This is suffering that is happening to us because of this, because of the broken world we live in and this broken thing that happened to one of us. And that when we lock arms, we're able to battle that together. And that is a corrective experience for the body then. So whenever the body experiences alert, danger, oh no, this sexual thing is happening and we're in danger, we're being violated, and the positive, like, nervous system new experiences, oh, my spouse moves closer, I feel connected, I feel protected. We talk about that. He holds me. It's okay that I don't want to have sex tonight. And there's acceptance. And then that is like the medicine being applied to that wound. And it's, the spouse, the couple, the spouse, the husband, and also the couple are empowered of, like, that is a blow against the dragon. And over time, when that is repeated, to just take my analogy all the way to the end, that eventually, like, defeats the dragon, banishes it, it doesn't come back. And that medicine continually being applied to that trauma wound, it heals.
Yes, yes. And I think that's such an important piece, to use your words from earlier, that it didn't have to be a life sentence. That just because I experienced this, or I've had some experiences in my life that have impacted me in this way, doesn't mean that it has to always be like this. That there is a pathway to healing and wholeness, and for things to be different in a permanent, lasting kind of way. There's another scenario that I've run into from time to time that is less common, but thus more confusing when you experience it. And it's really a co-occurring difficulty that is two different kinds of struggles, two different disorders happening at the same time. And the one is kind of a sensory disorder, right? It's really unrelated necessarily to sex at all. But I have had some clients and gals that, as we got into understanding what they experience both in the bedroom and outside the bedroom and their life as a whole, what we realized is there was kind of an undiagnosed sensory disorder that the wife experienced that made just touch feel obnoxious and irritating, and like, styrofoam going or nails on a chalkboard, kind of, to her nervous system in a way that made foreplay, kind of sensual touch, instead of feeling soothing and nurturing and connective and arousing, felt like nails on a chalkboard. It was like, and not because there wasn't an attraction there, not because there isn't a even sexual desire or interest or arousal, but really had to do with the struggle of the associated with the sensory disorder. And so it's, at first blush, can kind of present or look similar to like trauma, or like what we might experience if somebody's being triggered with trauma and having an aversive pullback kind of reaction. But instead of being associated with the trigger, is more of a nervous system sensory disorder difficulty. And so the route of trying to figure out that is really troubleshooting it as a sensory disorder, and understanding how to stretch the window of tolerance around certain kinds of touch and engagement, learning how to soothe, learning how to adapt the sexual interaction and foreplay in ways to not exacerbate or irritate the sensory struggle that's there, in a way that then becomes a total distraction and shutdown for arousal, right? If you can imagine trying to lean into arousal and turn on with someone like scratching a chalkboard next to your head. Right? Could be a little bit distracting. Could be like a little difficult to get in the mood and really engage with,
Yeah.
happening right there. And so, uh, if if that sounds like you, sometimes just kind of recognizing, I do have some sensory stuff that is, outside of sex experience, that it's not just in the bedroom about touch, but touch in other settings and experiences that feels really noxious also. Then it may be worth exploring some of the resources that are out there around sensory disorders and see if the shoe fits. And that might be a route of kind of troubleshooting what you're experiencing and what's going on, and might be able to help you have communication with your spouse, do like Tish was talking about in trauma situations where we can have kind of a common enemy and recognize that it's not really about acceptance or rejection or about the spouse or even our relationship. And so it's this third entity that we're dealing with, that we didn't choose, that we don't want, that we'd make go away if we could, but as part of our experience that we can then connect around, trying to figure out how to work together at overcoming that. And that can make all the difference in the world in really being able to collaboratively construct a sexual relationship that can be really meaningful and connective and fun and enjoyable for both spouses. A little
So,
bit different.
mhm. Mm. Yeah, so good. I so appreciate you sharing that, Josh. I'm thinking of one other scenario.
Yeah.
Um, and I know they don't give us any details about the relationship, but I know I've worked with couples where if there's been a lot of strife or contempt
Mm-hmm.
emotionally in the relationship, um, then that's going to impact even how you experience and can receive your spouse's touch. So if there's a lack of emotional safety in the relationship, I think just making sure that's connected, of knowing that your experience of touch and the health and connectivity emotionally and relationally in the relationship are directly correlated and impact each other. And so if there is a lot of contempt and strife, then that is probably impacting how you can receive your spouse's touch.
Definitely, can definitely be another component, and they're not mutually exclusive of each other. That sometimes there's layers of different things that are going on that we try to tease apart.
Yep.
We've got time for one last question here that I think is super, again, common and helpful and be fun for us to kind of talk through a little bit. And it's about, being romantic, right? And specifically around husbands maybe trying to be romantic and trying to figure out how to maybe for husbands that are not necessarily super romantic, about how to cultivate that, develop that, and from the perspective of the wife's question, how can a wife help facilitate that? How can a wife not sabotage that and kind of shoot herself in the foot in terms of what it is that she's wanting to develop? So I think this is a common experience, and certainly one that's very personal to me. That there's some guys out there who grew up and maybe they have older sisters, and that they're a younger sibling with older sisters, or they have a dad that's just very romantic and suave and kind of modeled for his sons kind of how to romance a woman and how to engage in that way. And for me, I had neither. That I'm a firstborn in my family, no older siblings. I have a sister, but she's 8 years younger than me. My dad was possibly the least romantic man ever to exist. It's and so I had absolutely nothing to draw from as a newly married man in terms of knowing how to be romantic. And it's just not fair. Like I look at, I have a 12-year-old son, and he has older sisters and has grown up around women his whole life. And he just has like this intuitive nature about what it is his sisters kind of want to hear and how to affirm them and compliment them in ways that, aren't intended to be romantic, but you can just see it flows really naturally. And I'm like, what? It's not fair. And that I feel handicapped. and how to approach this. So I can appreciate the question from a husband standpoint. For all the men out there that are in my boat and didn't grow up with sisters or a dad that kind of modeled that it's tough. It's tough to kind of, there's not one, for me, one bit of it that just like happens unintentionally or just happens in a natural flow of me being me.
Aww. I think that you're normalizing that though, because I think there can be this expectation on, of course, it's such a healthy desire for women to have, for wives to have, to be romanced and to desire that. And that is very healthy. And, but I think of balancing that with that might be something that's developed throughout your relationship for a lifetime. And so of being able to have the long game in mind and not have these expectations that your husband should be able to romance you and with the type of thoughtfulness that really it might take 10 years to develop. 10 years of you explicitly sharing what feels good to you and what you would like and what you need, not having the expectation that he just intuitively knows what you need or knows what you want, but that there's a sense of, just vulnerably sharing, like, this would be really fun sometime if we ever did this. And just being very, like, the things that are in your heart that you desire, to share them with your husband and not feel like if I have to share them, then it's not as romantic. If he doesn't come up with it on his own, and it's like, oh, that's like impossible standards for him to live up to, because if he did for you what he would want, then that is not going to resonate with you in the same way that he needs information about you. Because if you did for him what you would want, that's not going to probably resonate with him. So, I think having that understanding that that's something that is a rhythm that's built in a relationship over many, many years of sharing and expressing. I mean, I remember being newly married and I threw my husband, it's like, if you know my husband, I threw him a surprise party with all of these people, this like house full of people. And he's like, now know it's my husband. That's what I would want. Never, ever what he would want, Josh. And over the years when we became more open and he was like, yeah, I really hated that. That was horrible. It was like, like one of his worst nightmares. And so I think that those are the kind of learning experiences that we have to have a lot of grace for. That, that as, both spouses kind of venture out and make themselves vulnerable and try something, really appreciate the effort and the thoughtfulness of trying, and to let that be what's romantic and not be looking for this like magical hallmark moment. And if your husband can't create that, then he's not romantic. Because I think that can be a really skewed kind of perspective to have, that really steals like the true romance out of a relationship, which is this sense of like growing together, building together, developing this like knowing of each other. That is really, really special. And so.
I so appreciate it. As a husband, I so appreciate all the different pieces that you've highlighted. There's just, I mean, that's a clip worth listening to again and kind of revisiting, because there's so many nuances in what you just shared, Tish, that are super, super valuable. You know, from the vantage point of uh, the the Hollywood kind of myth that undermines so many relationships, that says, you know, if he really loves you,
Mm.
he will be able to read your mind and know what exactly what it is that you want, and be able to deliver that without you having to express any sort of insinuation that you are interested in that. That's the signature of true love right
Right.
there, right? In which, you know, to many men are like, right? That our mind reading abilities suck. Like we just don't have Vulcan mind meld, you know, just not able to read our spouse's mind. And it's not that we don't love our wife,
Right.
don't want to be pleasing to her, don't want to delight her. It's that we can't read minds. We can't in that. And maybe we can get lucky every now and then. You know, a blind squirrel finds a nut every now and then. You know, we can like pull off a lucky guess timing. But there's also this piece that, you know, the bait and switch of sorts that happens in dating and getting married, right? Because there's a lot of times wives will be in that place like, wait a minute, that's baloney. I'm not buying that one instant. When we were dating, he was like on target with all of those things. And there's you know, that's a fair kind of confusion that's there, right? That there's this kind of bait and switch thing that happens in dating versus marriage, right? That on the husband side of it, I say with a lot of husbands that are like, she couldn't keep her hands off me when we were dating. It's like she was interested in cuddling and interested in physical affection, engagement, and, you know, our whole relationship. We were like, we had to like work hard to create any sort of boundaries in a relationship whatsoever. And now we've been married for a little bit, and it's like, you know, she's pursues or initiates sex maybe 2 or 3 times a month. And that's, and I'm like, what happened?
Right.
That's not the vision of what I thought married sex life was going to look like. I thought it was going to look a lot more like the pursuit and initiation. I've been tricked, bait and switch, different dynamic. Or for the wife, like in this dynamic, that, you know, a sexually charged single man pursuing a woman who's in a, obsessively thinking about her all the time, can't
Mm.
get her off her mind, and is constantly kind of wooing and pursuing and engaging, and as like number one focus to the neglect of all other things in life, but that singular focus and pursuit. And then we get married, and it's like, wait a second, where'd all that attention go? Where did all that intentionality? Where did all of that pursuit go? Now he's like, I feel like I've dropped way down on the priority and importance list. You know, what's the deal with that? That's a really common kind of dynamic for husbands and wives to experience, kind of navigating, grieving in some ways, some of the changes that happen in the relationship when we move from dating kind of dynamic into a marriage dynamic, that are uh, not bad, but are different,
Yeah.
and really require intentionality in ways that maybe flowed much more naturally before. And
Yeah.
that the hormones and excitement of dating kind of made that pursuit of physical initiation, you know, didn't have to think about it very much, right? You know, and it didn't require a whole lot of intentionality.
Yeah.
When we get into marriage, we're like, oh, we need to be a little bit more intentional, that if we only initiate and pursue, when we hormonally have that push, and I'm in that place within our cycle that we, right around ovulation, where body drops an egg and gives a little hormonal push and says, go find your man and fertilize this thing. We only connect around then we're going to have distance and disconnect within the relationship. Likewise, for a husband, if you only engage in ways that are pursuing romancing, when you think about it, like Valentine's Day, when there's all sorts of signs kind of flashing saying, don't forget, then that's probably not going to put all the deposits in your spouse's love bank that she needs. Okay? Yeah. It requires more intentionality, and that intentionality isn't a reflection of not loving or not being into you. Getting back to that myth of, if he was really into me, then he wouldn't have to work. This wouldn't be work, it'd be easy. Like, it would just like flow, be natural. Just think of these things and do them.
I know. Oh, what you're saying is so important. The intentionality doesn't negate passion or romance. Right. And I think that you're talking about the shift of dating and the thrill of the pursuit and of the newness, and even of like the hormonal response in the body of what's happening chemically, and then transitioning into marriage, that's a really important part of transitioning. That it does, anyone who's passionate about anything, they've been very disciplined and intentional about learning about that subject or about that thing, and that intentionality has actually translated into deeper passion. And that is, I think, the shift you're talking about that happens from dating into marriage. And so to have the expectation that the ease of falling in love, that should be carried into like the building of a marriage, and kind of what our relational rhythms look like, and that doesn't require intentionality. Oh, it's just so much, it's an impossible pressure to live up to.
Totally. And us men, we tend to avoid failure like the plague. Like, it's why I don't golf, right? Because I'm terrible at golfing. And that if my buddies call me up and say, Josh, you want to go golfing? I'm like, no way. Why in the world would I want to go out for a scramble and look like a fool and just have my total inadequacy as a golfer put on display for all the world, for you guys to make fun of me at? Not going to do it. I'm totally going to avoid that domain where I feel like a failure. Okay? And so there's this dynamic that can get set up sometimes in a relationship that unintentionally, wives can actually sabotage the very thing that they want by sending this message about how much their husband sucks at being romantic. And maybe instead of appreciating effort, kind of criticizing the missing the mark or falling short or not being exactly the way that was hoped for, not living up to the fantasy of that, can over time, and it doesn't take very much time because this men are kind of weak egoed, kind of tender souls that we try to hide behind our toughness, and that then can really feel like a failure in that department, and can really avoid that. Just be like, I'm not even going to try in order just to be criticized or fail at that again. I'm just going to say, that's not me. You married the wrong man. You're going to have to get over it. And kind of cop out and bail out of putting in that intentionality and that effort, which isn't okay. It's not justifiable. It's not right for a man to take that attitude or that mindset. But there's a flip side of that where a wife can really shoot herself in the foot in some ways by being maybe what in her mind is trying to be helpful to her husband by either comparing to another husband and saying, she's maybe trying to hint at things that he could do to help uh, that department out a little bit more, but is inadvertently kind of creating this criticism and comparison piece that just feels defeating and to her husband and gets her further away from the very thing that she wants. I don't know if you've ever had that.
Yeah, I mean, as you share this, it makes me feel sad because I think it's robbing both of them from what they
Mm,
want. And I think of the expectation can really be kind of the launching off point of this lose-lose that you describe. That in the same way as we were talking about sexuality is this rhythm of expressing what we need and what we want, and that's very unique on our personality and where we're at this season of our life in this moment, that we're very unique individuals, and part of marriage is about building these internal maps of each other. And for, as if you're a wife desiring your husband to be more romantic, of being able to invite him into that space about sharing, what you want, but not in a demanding way, but in a way that sets him up for success. That we're teaching each other how to be thoughtful. We're teaching each other how to know each other in a way that feels very intimate. And so now I know when I want to be thoughtful on my husband's birthday. I know that it looks very different than a surprise party with a house full of people. And, I've been married this is just fresh in my mind this week. I've been married for 15 years, and I've just changed this is really a simple example, but was a season in my marriage I really liked fresh flowers. And then so I was like, so I made that clear, like I would love fresh flowers for special occasions or for my birthday. That would mean a lot to me. That would be like, I would love that as a gift. But then there was a season that I'm like, that's not practical. I would want to use that money for something else. Like this is what would feel good to me or thoughtful to me. But then just recently, I think like a month ago, I told him, this poor man, I was just how much I changed. And I was like, you know what? I think I miss fresh flowers. Like if you would want to send them to me, like just know that they would be welcomed. And this man, look at this.
Oh, Josh. And he's nailing it. Way to go, Hedger.
It meant so much to me. And how in the world could he read my mind or know that all of a sudden, but I think that the shooting, a wife shooting herself in the foot can be like, it comes out as more like, why don't you ever like send me flowers, or why don't you ever do thoughtful things for me? Or because I think in a wife, it can really bring up insecurity. Like if I was desirable enough, then he would want to pursue me and romance me. But he's not doing that. So either there's something wrong with me or there's something wrong with him. And we can get lost in this in the same way with sexuality of if I'm desirable enough, then they're going to be able to meet my needs and want me. Or if I am like suave enough, then I'm going to be able to meet her needs and sweep her off her feet. And the truth is, with it all, we are building internal maps of each other. And that's something that we build our whole lives. And so I don't know, maybe next year I'll be out of my fresh flower phase and I'll be sure to let my husband know.
I so appreciate that, Tish. And I think there's a lot of husbands out there that are like Josh and like myself. They're in that space of we really do want to love our wife well. And we really do want to engage in ways that make her feel special and that known and pursued and cared about, and that there's a real appreciation that I have when Cassie does the same things that you are talking about that set us both up for success, kind of help me know the things that she would enjoy and things that her heart is longing for, and is not like subtle and just kind of floating that out there in a passing kind of comment. hoping that I will pick up on that because I won't in that, or even a really blatant hint kind of in that hint in that because I won't pick up on that either, but just really explicit,
I love
hey,
this would
I
be
would love it if you would do this for me. That, you know, in fact, you know, my birthday's coming up in a month, and this would be great.
yes, it would
The
be
likelihood of that happening for her just went up like 1,000,000%. And then I have the opportunity to win with my wife, knowing exactly how to win with her. And it's a win for her, it's a win for me. And that just really sets us both up for success in a way that is, you know, really cool versus, you know, being set up for failure in a way that can really create a negative cycle for us. And, you know, the interesting thing about that dynamic is over the years, and it has been years, like you said earlier, Tish, the early in our relationship, we fought like cats and dogs about those kinds of things. And I felt defeated and she felt unloved. And it was just ugly kind of place. And as we both matured and grew in those things and have been walking in that over time, many of those things have that internalized mapping has taken place for me in a way that I find that I do and am able to engage in ways that I think of or that happen for me without her prompting or without her communicating, that flow out of that, internalizing that over the course of our relationship in a way that I never did or could early in our relationship. And that's been really cool for me to be able to do that. But it's also been really cool for her in a way that I don't think it would have ever materialized if we hadn't been able to mature through kind of that earlier phase of unrealistic expectations that we had for each other.
yeah. Oh, I love that you shared that. That's so good. And so I think of what we're saying is to not have the expectation that what takes 20 years to build should be automatic, intuitive, and in place after you walk down the aisle. But instead, that's part of being special to someone and making someone special to you is this continual, I'm intentionally setting my affection on you. I'm intentionally pursuing to know you better. Help me know you better. And I'm going to be vulnerable and I want you to know me better. And that explicit sharing our wants and desires is so key in every facet of our relationships.
Totally. Love it. Thanks for the question, and thanks for all of these questions. Tish, I've really enjoyed hanging out with you and I'm kicking back and forth around this really important topic, and appreciate all those who have sent in questions. And if you sent in a question and we didn't get to it, and we have coming up here in a few weeks another sex therapy focus My Counselor live time, where Tish and I would be back at it again, answering your questions and speaking to the different things. We've got topics like oral sex that are probably going to be covered in that next session, as well as other kinds of desire disorders and what about erectile difficulties, and there's all sorts of really practical and common things that folks have questions around. And it's not too late to send in questions for that time. You can inbox those to us, private message them on Facebook. You can go to MyCounselor.Online/ask and use the form there to submit anonymous questions and to us. You can comment on this video. If you're watching the replay of this video, you can add a comment as you're watching it, and our team will see that and see that it gets added to the list. And so we will receive that and be ready to speak to that and talk to that when we get back together. Any parting thoughts or comments from you, Tish?
It was fun today, Josh. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for watching.